March 15, 1952. The Manhattan Criminal Courthouse, Room 304. Lawrence Whitmore, the most respected defense attorney in New York, stood before a packed gallery of 300 witnesses. He had just called Bumpy Johnson a monkey. In 4 minutes, his career would be over. Not because of what Bumpy did, because of what 40,000 people in Harlem would do. Whitmore wore a $5,000 suit that morning. His shoes cost more than most Harlem families made in 6 months. He represented Vincent Gigante's organization, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The Italian mob paid him $200,000 a year to keep their men free. He had never lost a case. Never even came close. Bumpy Johnson sat in the witness box wearing a simple gray suit. 47 years old. 5'10". 170 pounds. Nothing special to look at. But every person in that room knew his name. The gangster who controlled Harlem. The man who made millionaires and buried enemies. The only black crime boss the Italian mafia respected enough to fear. The trial was simple. The mob wanted control of a numbers racket that brought in $3 million a year from Harlem. They needed Bumpy's testimony to take down a rival. Whitmore's job was to make Bumpy look like a criminal who couldn't be trusted. To humiliate him. To break him on the stand. If you want the full truth about what happened next, hit like so this story reaches more people who need to understand how power really works. Whitmore circled Bumpy like a shark. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Or should I say Bumpy? That's what they call you in the jungle you run, isn't it?" The courtroom went silent. Jungle. Everyone heard it. The judge, a white man named Harrison, said nothing. The prosecutor, another white man, looked at his papers. 30 reporters sat in the press box. None of them wrote the word down. Bumpy didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stared at Whitmore with eyes that had seen men die begging. Whitmore smiled. He thought he was winning. "Let me ask you directly, Mr. Johnson. How many men have you killed? 20? Give us a number we can write down." "I don't know what you're talking about," Bumpy said. His voice was quiet, like a teacher correcting a child. "You don't know." Whitmore laughed. He turned to the jury. 12 white faces looked back. This man runs Harlem like his personal plantation, and he doesn't know how many people he's murdered. Ladies and gentlemen, we're dealing with an animal here. A monkey who thinks He never finished the sentence. Bumpy stood up. The bailiff reached for his gun. Bumpy raised one hand. Just one hand. Palm out. The bailiff froze. "You got something to say to me," Bumpy said. "You say it like a man." Whitmore's smile died. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. Then Bumpy sat back down. Slowly. Like a king taking his throne. The lawyer tried to recover. "The witness is threatening me, Your Honor." Judge Harrison banged his gavel. "Mr. Johnson, you will control yourself or face contempt charges." Bumpy nodded. "Yes, sir, Your Honor. My apologies." But everyone in that room felt it. The shift. Whitmore had made a mistake. Not the insult. Everyone expected that. The mistake was thinking Bumpy Johnson was alone. 2 hours later, the trial broke for lunch. Whitmore walked to Delmonico's restaurant on Beaver Street. His favorite spot. He ate there every day. Steak and potatoes. $7.50. The waiters knew his order before he sat down. "Comment justice if you believe what happened next was deserved." He walked through the front door at exactly 12:30. The lunch crowd packed every table. Businessmen. Lawyers. Politicians. The room buzzed with conversation about stocks and cases and city politics. Whitmore moved toward his regular table in the corner. The host, a man named Robert who had served him for 8 years, saw him coming. Robert's face went white. He turned and walked to the kitchen without a word. Whitmore stopped. Confused. He looked around the restaurant. Every person in that room was staring at him. 42 people. He counted them later. 42 witnesses to what came next. A businessman in a gray suit stood up from his table. He threw $2 on his plate and walked out. Didn't look at Whitmore. Didn't say a word. Just left his half-eaten lunch and disappeared. Then another person stood. A woman in a blue dress. She left too. Then another. Then 3 more. Then the entire back section of the restaurant emptied like someone had shouted fire. In 90 seconds, 31 people walked out of Delmonico's. The remaining customers stared at their plates. Nobody would look at Whitmore. The waiters vanished into the kitchen. The host never came back. Whitmore stood in the middle of the restaurant, alone, surrounded by empty tables and abandoned meals. He understood. Finally, he understood. What Whitmore didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom realized, was that 17 reporters in that press box weren't just covering the trial. They were Harlem residents. They worked for the New York Amsterdam News, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender. Every black newspaper in America had someone in that room. By 11:15 that morning, 2 hours before lunch, 40,000 people in Harlem knew exactly what Lawrence Whitmore had said. The word jungle. The word monkey. The exact courtroom. The exact time. Every detail. But Bumpy Johnson didn't call for violence. He never did. Not for something like this. He made one phone call. One single phone call to a man named James who ran the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the largest black labor union in America. 42,000 members who worked on every train, in every restaurant, at every hotel in New York City. Type yes if you want to know how 42,000 people can change a city in 2 hours. James made 7 calls. 7 union representatives. Each one called 50 members. By noon, every black worker in Manhattan knew 3 things: Lawrence Whitmore's name, his favorite restaurant, his regular schedule. They didn't protest. They didn't riot. They didn't break any laws. They simply refused to serve him. Whitmore left Delmonico's at 12:45. He walked 3 blocks to another restaurant. The host saw him coming and locked the front door. He tried a diner on Pearl Street. The waitress took one look at his face and walked into the back. She never returned. He went to 5 restaurants in 2 hours. Not one would seat him. Not one would serve him food. He finally bought a hot dog from a street cart run by a Greek immigrant who didn't know who he was. But it didn't stop at restaurants. At 4 o'clock, Whitmore took a taxi back to his office. The driver, a black man named Samuel, pulled to the curb. Whitmore opened the door. Samuel looked in the rearview mirror, saw his face, and said, "Sorry, sir. Off duty." He drove away with his available lights still on. Whitmore tried to flag down 6 more taxis. Every single driver was black. Every single driver refused him. He walked 19 blocks back to his office in his $5,000 suit. Sweat poured down his face. People on the street recognized him now. They didn't say anything. They just stared. And kept walking. Share this video so more people understand how real power works without a single punch being thrown. At his office building, the elevator operator, a black man named Charles who had greeted him every morning for 6 years, looked straight ahead when Whitmore entered. "Elevator's broken, sir," Charles said. The elevator wasn't broken. It ran perfectly all day. Just not for Lawrence Whitmore. He climbed 11 flights of stairs. His secretary, a white woman named Dorothy, was crying when he arrived. "They called," she said. "All of them called." Who called? Everyone. The partners. The clients. Everyone. In 3 hours, 16 clients had terminated their retainer agreements. 2 were Italian mob associates. Even the mafia wouldn't touch him now. You don't do business with a man that 40,000 people hate. It's bad for business. The senior partners called an emergency meeting for 6 o'clock. Whitmore sat in a mahogany room with 8 men who had made him rich. They didn't yell. They didn't argue. They simply explained that his presence was damaging the firm's reputation. They would pay him for the remainder of the year. But he needed to leave. Today. At 7:30 that evening, Whitmore walked out of the building carrying a box with 8 years of his career inside it. He tried to hail a taxi. 5 passed him by. All with black drivers. He ended up taking the subway home. Standing room only. Pressed against 40 strangers who pretended he didn't exist. His wife left him 2 weeks later. She couldn't handle the stares at the grocery store. Couldn't handle the whispers at her charity events. Couldn't handle being married to the man who insulted Bumpy Johnson. If this shocked you about how organized communities can respond without violence, Comment respect below. But here's the part nobody talks about. The part that makes this story legendary. Bumpy Johnson never said Whitmore's name again. Not once. He didn't need to. 6 months after the trial, Whitmore moved to Boston. He tried to rebuild his practice. He failed. No black person in Boston would serve him either. The Porters Union had 42,000 members in 60 cities. They all knew his name. They all knew his face. He ended up in a small town in Vermont, working insurance claims for $18,000 a year. A man who once made $200,000. A man who wore $5,000 suits and ate $7 steaks. He spent his last days in a town of 800 people where nobody knew who Bumpy Johnson was. He died in 1967. Alone. Forgotten by everyone except the 40,000 people in Harlem who never forgot what he said in that courtroom. The trial ended 3 days after the incident. Bumpy testified for 6 more hours. The new attorney never insulted him. Never raised his voice. Asked simple questions and let Bumpy answer. Bumpy left the courthouse to a crowd of 2,000 people waiting on the street. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They just stood there in silence, watching him walk to his car, showing him he wasn't alone. The newspapers called it the quiet protest. Others called it the silent treatment. But in Harlem, they called it the Whitmore Effect. Cross Bumpy Johnson, and you don't get hurt. You get erased. You become a ghost in your own city. Alive but invisible. Walking but dead. The Italian Mafia sent a message to Bumpy 3 weeks later. Vincent Giganti himself wrote it. We apologize for our attorney's words. They don't reflect our organization's respect for you and your people. The Mafia apologized to a black gangster in 1952 because 40,000 people moved as one. But the real lesson isn't about Bumpy Johnson. It's about what happens when a community decides someone has crossed a line. They didn't need guns. They didn't need violence. They needed coordination, communication, unity. Lawrence Whitmore thought words had no consequences. He thought he could say anything in that courtroom because he had power, money, connections. A white face in a white city. He learned the hardest way possible that power isn't about how much money you have. It's about how many people will stand with you when everything falls apart. Bumpy Johnson had 40,000. Lawrence Whitmore had none. For minutes. That's how long it took from the moment Whitmore walked into Delmonico's until he understood his career was over. 4 minutes of standing in an empty restaurant, surrounded by abandoned tables, watching people flee from his presence like he carried plague. The judge who allowed the insult? Judge Harrison lost his re-election campaign 8 months later. Harlem voted as a bloc. 42,000 votes against him. He never worked in law again. The prosecutor who stayed silent? He apologized publicly in the New York Amsterdam News. Wrote a full-page letter explaining he should have objected. Should have defended Bumpy. He kept his job. Barely. The reporters who spread the word? They became legends in black journalism. One of them, Marcus Webb, later wrote that covering the Whitmore trial was the proudest moment of his career. Not because of what he wrote. Because of what he didn't write. He didn't write that Bumpy Johnson was a gangster. A criminal. The threat. He wrote exactly what Whitmore said. Word for word. And let the community decide. Comment below what word you think has the most power, money or unity. I want to see what you believe. Today, most people don't know this story. It never made the major newspapers. The New York Times ran 3 sentences about Whitmore's resignation. No explanation. No context. Just another lawyer leaving a firm. But in Harlem, they still tell this story. Grandmothers tell their grandchildren. Fathers tell their sons. Because it's not really about Bumpy Johnson. It's about what's possible when people move together. When they coordinate. When they refuse to accept disrespect. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. 62 years old. Heart attack at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. 7,000 people attended his funeral. The streets shut down for 6 hours. Every business in Harlem closed. Not because the police ordered it. Because the people chose it. Lawrence Whitmore died a year before Bumpy. In Vermont. The local newspaper ran a 2-sentence obituary. No family attended the funeral. For people showed up. All were from the funeral home. 2 men. 2 lives. 2 deaths. One ended as a legend. The other ended as a ghost. And it all changed in 4 minutes inside a restaurant where nobody would sit near him. Because you can't survive in a city when 40,000 people decide you don't exist. The Whitmore Effect. Still whispered about in Harlem. Still taught in Black history classes that don't appear in textbooks. Still remembered by the generation that saw what happens when you disrespect a community that refuses to be broken. Bumpy Johnson never threw a punch that day. Never made a threat. Never raised his voice. He made one phone call. And proved that the most powerful weapon isn't violence. It's solidarity. If you found this story powerful, hit that like button right now. Comment below which historical figure you want to hear about next. Malcolm X, Madam C.J. Walker, or Robert F. Williams. And subscribe because these stories don't appear in school textbooks, but they changed America forever. These are the truths they don't want you to know.